Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to CNU Talks Live at Lunch. My name is Grace Marks. I am a class of 2021 Captain for Life, as well as your Assistant Director of Alumni Relations here at Christopher Newport University. I am so excited to join you today as our moderator in this amazing partnership hosted by Christopher Newport Alumni Society and your Office of Alumni Engagement. These talks over the past months have brought us a variety of members from our Captain for Life community, from professors to coaches to staff members to alumni, all doing incredible work that speaks to our hearts and our minds. Today, I'm excited to introduce to you Cami Castleberry and Dr. Rebecca Bromley-Trujillo from the Wason Center for Civic Leadership here at Christopher Newport. Cami is not only a proud captain for life as a member of the class of 2020, but she is also our director for the Wason Center for Civic Leadership. And I have been able to know her both as a student when we were students together and then after graduation. And it's an honor to get to work with her and have her here on our campus, serving her alma mater and our Virginia community. She has worked in a variety of roles from political campaigns, as well as a chief of staff for a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. She's also dedicated to pursuing higher education, and she is a graduate from the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership's Political Leaders Program, as well as the American Legislative Exchange Council's National Legislative Staff Academy. Whew, that one was a mouthful, Cami. But amazing work that she's done. And she is also currently preparing to, or she is actually pursuing her master's in public policy, as if all of the work that she's doing isn't enough. We also are so grateful to have Dr. BT with us. That's what I called her when I was a student of hers. But she is our research director for the Wason Center. She joins us with such amazing experience, first getting her BA in political science from the University of Texas, San Antonio, then her master's and PhD in political science from Michigan State University. Her research covers such a breadth of things, but specifically, she looks at state and local climate change policy efforts and the relationship between public opinion and public policy, and how science is used in the policy process. Her work has appeared in a variety of journals, including the Review of Policy Research, Climate Change, and the Journal of Public Policy, among others. But today, they will be working with us and sharing with us about their work with the Wason Center for Civic Leadership, talking about the polling operations that they're doing, the student programs that they're running, and then also talking about the polls that they're currently running for the race for governor that we have here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So we are so excited and so honored that they're joining us in this Super Bowl of a week leading up to the election. So please enjoy getting to hear from them. And then also remember that there will be time for questions at the end, but don't be afraid to put those in the Q&A box down below for then after they're done sharing with us. But with that, I hand things over to Cami and Dr. BT.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome, Grace. I can't see any of you, unfortunately, but I just want to say thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. I know everybody's probably very busy this week, as always, so it's a pleasure to spend some time with you all. Obviously, we're about a little less than a week away from the elections, and so I think what everybody's probably here to hear about is our most recent poll that we did. So I won't take up too much time in regards to our Wason Scholars program, but I just want to give a brief overview for you all before I hand it over to Becky. Just in case if you're not familiar with what the Wason Center looks like on present day, because I'm not sure when any of you all graduated, but when you were a student, I know when I was, the Wason Center was known as the Wason Center for Public Policy, and we had a call lab on the second floor of McMurrin Hall where students could get a job as a student caller, and they basically did the work, the legwork for our surveys. We shifted a little bit in 2020 and expanded that when Judy and Harry Wason, the folks behind the Wason Center, decided that they wanted to continue to expand the mission, and that's when we did the reformation to the Wason Center for Civic Leadership from the Center for Public Policy. And so with that came the Wason Scholars program. So the Wason Scholars program is a really unique opportunity for students that are in the political leadership program, which I'm sure some of you were probably in PLP. Students that are accepted into PLP when they're applying to be a freshman here, they are then sent the opportunity to apply to be a Wason Scholar. We take around 7 to 9 students per year, and so it's a very small cohort of typically only about 30 students, no more. Currently, we're sitting at 28. And so they spend 4 years getting to know one another, growing together in civic leadership, and having a lot of really unique opportunities. Some of those opportunities are Captain's Vote Day, which we just had our second annual one a couple of weeks ago, which is open to the public and to the entire CNU community, where our students have all sort of nonpartisan groups and both political parties and all various campaigns that are present on campus in the CNU Plaza between the Tribble Library and the David Student Union, where students can learn more about campaigns. They can register to vote with the Newport News Registrar. They can apply to get their absentee ballot if they don't want to change to voting in Newport News while they're a student here. It's just a really great opportunity for students to learn more about the election process. And then they also have the opportunity to win, or not win, sorry, get a free t-shirt if they complete the student election survey that Becky launched last year for the very first time. So that's always exciting to see kind of where our students are landing in politics and policy. Some other things that we do, we take them to the Capitol every year in Richmond so they can get exposed to the legislative process and meet their lawmakers, meet lobbyists, learn what their work looks like. We've gotten to watch a lot of students kind of find their passions there and not really expect that. And so it's really unique to watch these students grow intellectually with their leadership skills, their networking skills, and figure out what do they want to do when they walk across that stage in May when they graduate. So it's a great opportunity. We love our students. We're very thankful for all of them and all of their hard work, because obviously the program does add a lot of things to their day-to-day and their semesters. And so when they take that time to prioritize the Wason Scholars program, it really makes us what we are. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Becky and let her talk to you about our survey program.
Hi, everyone. And thanks, Grace, for the warm introduction as well. Grace was a student of mine and one of my favorites, I will say. And thanks, Cami, for sharing all that great information about our programming. So I'm going to obviously talk to you about polling. I'm the research director, so focused on the surveys, and I'm in charge of writing the surveys, analyzing the data, and talking to the media and various community groups about what we're doing. So I'm going to start with just some basics of how we go about doing our polling. This is where I tend to get the most questions in these sorts of events. So certainly feel free to ask questions about polling methodology once we get through all of this. But just to begin, we are doing election surveys right now because, of course, there are elections in Virginia. And for those surveys, we do use what we call a likely voter model. So we start with a registered voter list, and then we draw a sample from that of folks that have voted at least twice in the last 4 general elections. This is because those are the people most likely to show up on election day. And so those types of surveys tend to be more accurate in terms of what the election outcomes are going to be. And then we also ask them at the top end of the survey whether they plan to vote, have already voted, or do not plan to vote. If they say they do not plan to vote, then they're immediately dropped out of the survey because that means they're not a likely voter. Now, when we are doing our policy surveys, which we do one annually, the State of the Commonwealth survey that comes out in about January typically, that survey, we do the entire adult Virginia registered voter population for that survey. And it's really to get a sense of where folks stand on issues that we expect to be before the General Assembly. And so it informs the democratic process by allowing our legislators to understand where people stand on various issues. And I also say that it tends to demonstrate that Virginians have a lot of common ground on many issues that folks tend to think are polarized, but they're not always as polarized as you might expect. Now, in terms of our surveys, we go for the gold standard of 800 respondents because that tends to lead to a more representative survey that doesn't require a lot of correction with weighting. And so it also allows us to kind of drill down into deeper levels of the data. And so when we're looking at, we want to know, okay, where are people standing on their vote for governor? But we also want to know where women versus men stand, or where younger voters versus older voters stand. And so having that larger number allows you to look at those crosstabs with a little bit of more certainty. Now, we use a weighting process. This is a mathematical process at the back end of the survey to make sure that we are getting that representative sample of Virginians. Now, just doing the random digit dialing, that process tends to get you a fairly close to representative sample. But because there are some people that are more or less likely to answer the phone and take a survey, you do tend to get some differences between the sample that you draw and the actual population. And that's where weighting comes in and is absolutely critical. So any surveys that you see being reported that don't report that they're weighting them, I would not consider those to be useful surveys. So we do weight by education, race, gender, region, and age. And for election polls, we're looking at that expected electorate. So we use exit poll data from past elections and census data. And for the Virginia adult population, we are using census data for Virginians specifically, and we make sure we capture the broad range of Virginians we have. Now, keep in mind, all polls have a margin of error. If you're not seeing that reported, I would be skeptical of that survey. Usually a margin of error is going to be somewhere between 3 and 4. Sometimes you might see a lower one, but that's pretty rare. Occasionally you see a higher one. I'd say if it's much higher than 4, I'd be a little bit skeptical of that survey as well. The other thing to keep in mind is polling is looking at a moment in time or a week of time. And certainly things shift over the course of an election. And so we see that shifting happening in our polling. We try to do as many polls as we can throughout the election season to capture that. And certainly if we had more money, we would do even more surveys. So if you're ever thinking of contributing, we'd love that. So also, you want to look at the trend. We have survey data from our surveys that I think is very reliable, but our survey is one of many that happens in Virginia. It's useful to look at the collective data to see if there are trends happening across all of those polls, because that's stronger evidence that we're getting it right. So Cami, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, and I'll talk about our latest poll. So we just conducted a survey between October 21st and 23rd. This is our final election survey for this election season. We've got 803 respondents. Again, these are Virginia likely voters. Our margin of error is plus or minus 4.1. So take all of our numbers with that in mind. And go ahead to the next one. So we always start our election surveys getting a gauge of enthusiasm, because enthusiasm tends to correlate with voter turnout. And so in this case, people seem to be fairly enthusiastic. So if you kind of add up these first two numbers here, very enthusiastic or somewhat, that's 85%. And that suggests that we're going to have relatively high turnout, at least for a statewide election. Turnout is always higher for presidential elections and congressional elections. But for state elections, I do expect this one to have pretty good turnout, especially given these numbers. You do see some variation across partisan ID. So Democrats and Republicans are pretty similar, especially when you add up those vary and somewhat, they're almost identical. And then for independents, enthusiasm is always a little bit lower among independents, typically because either they're independent because they're feeling a little bothered by the political process or the parties, or they're less engaged in politics. So that tends to show up there. And you can see we break this down by gender, race, age, and whether individuals have college degrees or not. So you can see some notable differences. Older voters tend to be more enthusiastic than younger voters. Not much difference by race or gender. We do see some differences based on college degree or not, at least at the top category here. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that. You can go to the next one. Now for the governor's race, really throughout the election, we have seen Abigail Spanberger, former Congresswoman, ahead of Earl Sears. And our latest poll, she's up by 7, as you can see here. And in a slide or two, I think I'll show you that trajectory over time, but I'll stick here for a second. So you can see that, Earl Sears, she's getting pretty high support among her own party, so Republicans, and that probably will go up even a little bit more by election day because people tend to kind of line up around their parties. And then Spanberger also has high support from her own party. You see Spanberger is outperforming Earl Sears among independents, which is a really crucial demographic to winning gubernatorial races in Virginia. And then you've got some gender differences, and some of this is typical of what we expect in terms of partisan behavior. So women on average are more liberal than men, so we do see some of that showing up here in terms of women's support being higher for Spanberger, men's support being higher for Earl Sears. And then especially in white versus Black voters, pretty stark differences, although there's still a decent amount that are undecided among Black voters. So we'll have to see how that shakes out at the end there. But Black voters are supportive of Spanberger. Earl Sears has the edge among white voters. And then Spanberger has the edge among younger voters. They're pretty similar for the older voters. And then the college versus non-college, this is just a common trend we are seeing where voters with college degrees are trending towards the Democratic Party, and that's been going on for about a decade. And we're seeing those without college degrees trending more towards the Republican candidate. So you can go to the next one, Cami. This is the latest polling, not just from us, but various pollsters. This is from the New York Times. I like to point out because, Christopher Newport University has a really good reputation. That little diamond that you see next to our name indicates that we are a select pollster. To get that rating, you have to have a demonstrated track record of accuracy. You have to be linked to a professional polling organization, which we are, and we also have that track record. And then you also have to use probability sampling, which we do as well. And so I would say generally you should trust select pollsters on average more than others. And so, all of those, like the Suffolk poll, the Washington Post, George Mason, those are pretty reliable surveys. You can see that we're coming at slightly different numbers in the last round of polls here, but all of these surveys have a margin of error. So they're all within the range of each other. So I think pretty consistent consensus that Spanberger is doing well, and based on these data, I would say expected to win. But of course, what matters is voter turnout. So people showing up to vote in early voting or election day, and certainly things can shift at the end. So we'll have to see where this lands. You can go to the next one, Cami. And this is just showing our polling on the governor's race over time. So there's been some modest tightening in this race in our last poll, but still Spanberger is hitting that 50% plus in terms of the polling data. So it suggests that she's probably got this, but of course things can still shift. You can go to the next one. And I did want you to see how it looked back in 2021. There was a much different context than there is this year. So for the gubernatorial election in 2021, Biden was in the White House and he was fairly politically unpopular at the time. And that was the context that heavily drove this race. That's not the only explanatory factor, but it's a big one because Virginia has the history of voting against the party in power in the White House. And it's almost entirely consistent with one exception back in 2013. And so this context this year is much different. And then we've got a Republican in the White House who's also fairly politically unpopular in the state of Virginia. And so in 2021, the context generally benefited Republicans. In this election year, the context tends to benefit Democrats, although the Attorney General scandal has thrown kind of a wild card into that. But so far, it's looking like that's primarily affecting the AG race and not the gubernatorial race. Next slide, please. All right, so the lieutenant governor's race has gotten much less attention. And so you can see here it's pretty tight in our polling. Ghazala Hashmi, state senator, she is currently leading Reed by 2 points. So that's very narrow. There's a decent chunk of undecideds as well. And I do tend to expect these numbers to be more closely linked to the governor's race. And so there's not a lot of split ticket voting that we tend to see between the governor and lieutenant governor. So I expect Hashmi's numbers to actually come closer to Spanberger's come election day. But clearly this is a more competitive race than the governor's race based on our polling data. And I think I'll leave it at that for that one in the interest of time. So for the attorney general's race, this is the one that has seen the largest shift over the course of the campaign season. And that's obviously, because you might be aware that there's a text message scandal. Jay Jones has sent some text messages a few years ago indicating some violent rhetoric towards political opponents. This has gotten a ton of media coverage, both just the traditional media, but also a lot of advertising from the candidates. And so voters are pretty saturated with this information. They're pretty aware of it, and it's clearly affecting their vote choice. And so, we've got Miyares up by 1. That's the Republican current attorney general, so the incumbent. And in our last poll, he was down by 6. So that's a pretty meaningful flip in less than a month. And certainly the scandal is the primary reason for that. And so you can see among independents, that's where Jones took the biggest hit. And so right now, Miyares is leading among independents. Jones was previously leading by 5 among independents. So that flip, that's where Jones is struggling and Miyares is doing much better now. Now, in terms of what I expect on election day, this one is a big question mark because it really just depends primarily on what those independent voters do. And I do suspect that some independents will essentially just not vote in the AG race because they're bothered by the scandal and maybe they were Democratic leaning independents. And so they might just, sit it out. But they also might end up kind of aligning with their partisan identity when it comes to election day. So they might be kind of questioning their decision now, but when it comes to election day, they'll show up and end up voting with their partisan lean, in which case that would benefit Jones and be bad for Miyares. So it's really anyone's guess what voters are going to do on this race, and it's very tight. So you can go to the next one. And this just shows that trajectory that I just told you about. So initially Jones leading Miyares in our first 2 polls, and then you see that flip happen right at the end there. Next slide. Now, in terms of policy issues, the overall top issues are threats to democracy, cost of living, inflation, and then healthcare. But you can see some important differences that I've highlighted between partisans based on gender, race, age, and college degree. And so you can see kind of across, with the exception of Republican identifiers, most of our various demographic categories are seeing threats to democracy as a top issue. And then every single category of partisanship or demographics is saying inflation. And so that's pretty consistent. Where you're seeing the differences, so for Republicans, their top issues after that inflation issue is immigration and crime. Well, of course, immigration is actually slightly above inflation for Republicans. And so those are a very different set of issues from the others in the survey, with the exception of white voters who also placed immigration as a top issue. But for independents, it's that threats to democracy, inflation, K through 12 education. So they're the only group where K through 12 is popping up in their top 3. And then you can see that especially, so white voters and Black voters have pretty different numbers here. So for Black voters, inflation and healthcare are their top issues, followed by threats to democracy. And you can see some differences on the others as well. So we can go to the next slide. Now, we also asked a series of questions about the text scandal, because this has obviously been a huge shakeup to the races. And so we first asked folks, how much have they heard about those news reports regarding the text messages? You can see that most people have heard at least a little. Almost everyone has heard at least a little. Only 14% are saying they haven't heard at all. And it does vary a bit by party ID. So you can see that Republicans are reporting that they've heard about it a lot. Independents, still 51% are saying they've heard about it a lot. 21% say some. So quite a bit of saturation of information on the text scandal itself. And then we sort of telescope down in our next question and only ask it for those that said at least they've heard a little. And so among those that have heard at least a little, they've heard some, or they've heard a lot, these respondents are saying that it's a fair amount are saying it's either very likely or somewhat likely to affect their vote choice for attorney general. Though, about a little over a third are saying that it's not at all likely to affect their vote choice. And you can see that variation among partisans there. And then we then telescope further to that next question just under there. So just asking people that have said that top three, either very likely, somewhat likely, or not very likely to affect their vote choice. And so we asked them, will it make you more or less likely to vote for Jay Jones, or has there been no change? And you can see, of the plurality there is less likely. So more folks saying that it's making them less likely to vote for Jones. That's particularly true of independents. Among Republicans, they were not likely to vote for Jones either way. So that's not necessarily going to change anything. But for independents, that's a big deal. And that's where Jones is definitely weak. And so we'll have to see what independents do on election day. All right. I think I got through all of it. Happy to take your questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Of course.
Amazing. So everyone, you're welcome to drop your questions down in that question box. But first up, wanted to ask, because you shared all of that data, what do you always find the most interesting coming out of polls? Whether that's something that's typical or atypical, but what are you always curious and looking for and most interested in?
So, I mean, for me personally, I'm a policy person, so I'm always fascinated to see what are the issues that voters are thinking about in elections. And we do tend to pretty much see the economy being a top issue, or inflation, every election, but it's really the other ones I'm curious about. Like, what are people elevating in one given election? And so for this one in particular, obviously people are really concerned about the cost of living. Like, prices are high, so that's on a lot of people's minds. And then also healthcare, and that really relates to sort of the nationalized nature of state politics. And so that's a topic of conversation at the federal level. So that sort of bleeds down into state politics. And so I find that very interesting.
And on the flip side, with my background in campaigns, I like seeing the different campaign tactics and how they're affecting how the polls end up showing what voters are thinking and if they actually work at all. And so seeing what the effectiveness is of certain campaign approaches is really interesting and fascinating to watch.
Yeah. Speaking of seeing the campaign tactics, what have you seen that's either been surprisingly effective or hasn't been working anymore in this election cycle?
Well, I'm sure Becky's got a lot of thoughts on that with our survey
I'm sure
stuff,
you do
but
too.
really, you kind of saw some very, like, in my opinion, a lot of things that were happening. There wasn't really a clear message of what each campaign was running on, essentially, especially compared to the gubernatorial when Youngkin was one of the nominees. Like, he had a very clear message, and it didn't really seem like there was clear messaging. But then when the Jay Jones text scandal happened, it went from like, who cares about messaging, the text messages. And so that's been a curveball that I don't think any of us really expected to happen. And pretty much all of the ads that you see are either trying to get at either Spamberger or Sears on their debate performance, which, if any of you watched that debate, I'm sure everybody has their own opinions on how that went. But it's either that or you're hearing about the text messages. And so I was really interested to see, am I just in this like bubble of paying attention to politics, or is the general population actually hearing about the text messages? And so I was relatively surprised on our results to see how many people had actually heard about them.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the strategies I'm seeing at the sort of the top of the ticket, so the governor's race, it really did start out with, I mean, I'd say Spamberger's campaign was most heavily focused on things like pocketbook issues, so cost of living and that sort of thing. I've also seen her focus a bit on healthcare and on reproductive rights. And then for Earl Sears, she has kind of shied away from talking about the economy very much, which does make a strategic sense in a way, because typically voters punish the party in power when the economy is struggling. And right now we have a Republican in the White House and we have a Republican governor. And so talking about economic issues might actually be problematic for Republicans. And we've seen the flip of this back in 2024. So some Democrats shied away from talking about the economy. So obviously both parties do that kind of strategy. So not picking on anybody, but in terms of this campaign season, Earl Sears has more leaned into the culture war issues, so issues around transgender policy with sort of the first wave of her ads. And then, you see more recently, yes, just that heavy focus on the text messaging scandal. And that's every single race is covering the text messaging scandal on the Republican side. They're trying to highlight that, tie candidates to Jay Jones. And so, yeah, I mean, it just totally changed the dynamic of the messaging as soon as that broke.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I appreciate that. I know from the consumer perspective, seeing all these ads, I was like, wow, I just can't wait for election day because I get hit with them back to back, like both parties,
Yeah,
and then I'm like, okay, guys. But I will say, I have noticed I have learned a lot less about people's policy from the ads this year. Instead,
yeah.
they've had like really like pithy taglines at the end that have like, yes, they stick with me because I'm like, that's crazy that that was that person's ad campaign. But also I'm like, I learned nothing about your policy from that. I just learned you don't like this person. So that's been interesting.
Yeah.
And then also interesting the difference in coverage between what I'm seeing on TV, like when we're watching things or the ads that get placed while we're streaming versus than what I see covered on like social media. Because I
For sure.
personally haven't seen ads about the text messages. I've seen that in coverage on social media and things and different news accounts I follow there. So it's definitely interesting the different strategies we see people use now where we're all consuming so much content, but you're consuming content in different spaces and different things are being pushed in those areas. Um,
100%.
so yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely so interesting. So we also had someone who joined in and said, thank you so much for sharing those interesting polls. And then looking to the future, if Democrats win the governor's office and retain control over the General Assembly, the center oh my gosh, will the center survey Virginians about their thoughts on redistricting the state's congressional districts?
100% yes. I mean, that's a topic of conversation right
Yeah.
now, and it's going to continue to be, I think, moving into the next season. So yeah, I think we would ask something about that in our January
Have you
survey
done
since it's
any
so
surveys
timely.
on that yet?
So we have not on that. Like back in the day, we did some surveys on the redistricting commission that was established, the independent commission, but we have not surveyed on the kind of focus on a constitutional amendment that would allow the General Assembly to redistrict the congressional seats if other states also do so. So it's an only if situation. They won't do
Gotcha.
it unless other states do it. But yeah, we'll have to see. It's very controversial in many ways, and the the current attorney general, has weighed in on that issue as well. So that kind of sets up an interesting campaign dynamic as well.
No, that's a great question because funny enough, a couple nights ago, I haven't even told Becky this, but a couple nights ago I was watching TV and it hit me. I thought, ooh, for our state of the Commonwealth this year, we're probably going to have to ask Virginians how they feel about it. And then I realized it was approaching midnight and it probably was not a good idea to text Becky that.
It's all good. Cami, if you want to text me at midnight, you're good.
Well, look, you just got permission. You're in the clear now. Way to go.
Sweet.
Awesome. And I mean, also kind of related potentially to the State of the Union, if this isn't something you've covered already. Do you guys have any numbers for the specific issues like ICE aggression or the direct support for the president and how that then affects people's choice for governor?
So we didn't ask any specific policy questions about the president. We considered that, but we were trying to dig
Mhm.
into some various things happening in Virginia. But I would say generally the popularity of the president is the most impactful on what's happening here in Virginia, not necessarily his specific policies, but like how popular he is generally. And so I do think certainly his various actions matter, and probably some of our fellow Virginians would support some of his actions and not others. We did ask about some of that stuff on the student survey, so our CNU students certainly had some thoughts. But yeah, it's we have not asked in our statewide polls.
Cool. Thank you. And then I really appreciate how you also highlighted kind of the integrity that our polls have gained on like the national scale. I was actually talking about that with my husband today, and he was like, "Wait, people like CNU gets their polls quoted like in the news." I was like, "Yeah, we're super serious. It's awesome."
Yeah.
But how long have we kind of had that recognition, and how long did it take for us to get that? I think you called it select pollster status. Like, how did we get that? How long did that take, and how long have we been there?
We've been there quite a while. I
Mhm.
can't I don't know the exact year that we started to be called a select pollster, but it's been several years. Certainly since I've been here, which I started in 2020 or 2019. But anyway, right before the pandemic, I started, and we did have that select pollster rating, and we were already really looked upon as a serious pollster, and we were graded as the highest pollster in the states, and that's been true for for at least 6 years, but longer than that. And part of it is, the sort of foundation that Quentin Kidd, who's our now provost, and Judy Wason set for our polling operation. They're always shooting for, we want nonpartisan, not biased polling. We want quality polling. So we've always shot for the high numbers in terms of our sample sizes and our really credible methodology. And we take it very seriously. Like we really want to have the trust of Virginians and others in the nation. So yeah, it's been a long time, and we feel very good about it and continuing that.
Yeah, I like to try and compare. When I worked on campaigns, I used to pay a Republican or Democrat pollster to poll people in my district that I was running a campaign in. And they usually worked for one party or the other, and they would pull for registered voters that are likely or most likely to vote Republican. So you never really cared about Democrat, Independent, Republican. Maybe you do something on independence. So it's a totally different operation versus the work that the Wason Center does, because you're looking at likely registered voters that we don't necessarily care, are they going to vote Republican or not? Are they going to vote Democrat or not? Like, we want to get an overall synopsis of the actual voter population. And so the weighting and all the work that Becky does behind the scenes that nobody knows about, I don't even understand exactly how she does it, but I mean, it's remarkable work, and it's what allows us to have the credibility that we do. So having a political scientist like Becky herself is truly a blessing here for sure.
Thanks,
No,
Cami.
yeah, absolutely. No, and I really appreciate, and honestly didn't think about for so long until I started learning more about your guys' work, but it even matters of like, yes, is this person going to the polls? If we're going to be weighing them in this poll we're predicting. And it absolutely makes sense, but like you said, we're so grateful to have a scientist behind us on these things working to just think critically about that. And I think it just speaks so highly to the work that you guys are doing. But then I think it's also so cool that students get to be brought in on this, even though I know it's shifted from the policy center to now the civic leadership. But I mean, I was one of the Wason poll callers when I was a first year
Love
student,
it.
second year student. I learned so much getting through those surveys. Also, it was such an interesting experience of the people you get to talk to.
Yes.
Wild. Those were always so crazy and so fun exchanging stories with your fellow pollster.
Yes.
But we're just so grateful for the work that you guys do. And so, just one more question, and on the actual practical side of the work that you guys are doing with polls. So now we see more polls doing with text. And you guys, do you do polls with text, or are you guys doing them all by calling right now?
Right now, we're doing all by calling, and we've actually discussed pretty heavily doing the text to web. So the reason that some pollsters are starting to do that
Mm-hmm.
is that they might be more likely to reach younger folks that way,
Mm-hmm.
because, with cell phones, I mean, we are reaching tons of cell phones. Almost
Yeah.
usually 80% of our respondents are by cell phone. But it's possible that at some point we will stop getting young people responding to those in
Yeah.
particular. And so some pollsters are starting to do that. We may end up doing that. The only reason we haven't as of yet is because we're still getting the representative number of people across the range of age and other and region, et cetera. But if we weren't, then I would absolutely pivot to that. And that's, I think, what's key about polling is that you really need to be aware of what's happening and the non-response bias challenges, and try to meet those and make sure that you're addressing them. And so far, the live calling is working for us. It's
Mm-hmm.
expensive. It takes a long time to get people on the phone. So, it used to be we could call 20,000 people and get 800 respondents. Now we have to call like 60,000 people. So we get them. We eventually get people to answer the phone. It just takes longer, so it costs more. But it's possible that we will pivot to doing some text to web just to get a higher response rate.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I definitely received a couple texts this election season asking for polls, but then it's also a little tricky where I'm like, is this a scam? Because now we get so many scam texts versus
Yes.
real texts. So that'll be definitely an interesting challenge as you guys continue to move forward. But thank you to everyone who asked questions. We also had people tuning in saying just thank you so much for sharing and for setting such a high bar. And I really do echo that of thank you so much for the integrity that you guys bring to our polls, because hearing where people actually are at is what matters. And I'm so grateful that that's something that's on our campus, and that's also the spirit and leadership that you guys are leading this campus and our students in. So thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Grace.
Yes, of course. And so,
Thank
and then
you.
thank you to all of you for tuning in today. We are so grateful that we get this opportunity just to connect our Captains for Life with just more information to touch our hearts and minds, but also hopefully help us learn something new about our campus and about our world. We will be back next month in November, and we'll actually be hearing from some students next month as they tell us about a podcast that they started on campus called CNU on the Lawn. So we're really
Oh, that's
excited. And
awesome.
until then, we'll be seeing you all next month. Thank you guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.